Aloha and welcome to the 11th Annual Hawaii Energy Conference, presented by Maui Economic Development Board with support from the Maui County Office of Economic Development. Please welcome Luana Kawaa.
E nā hoa maka mai o a o keia honua nei mai kahi pai a kahi pai. Nā hoa I hele māmau loa mai ka aina o Maleka a I Hawaii nei. E ko Hawaii, nā kupa o ka aina mai ka moku o ke ave a I ke o nene e o ni I hau. E nā kupuna, nā makua, nā opio a me nā keiki. He welina aloha keia ia oko pākahi. Aloha. Let's try that aloha one more time. You've had your coffee, hopefully, right? Let's try that aloha one more time. Aloha. Oh, I felt that one. Mahalo nui. It is my pleasure and my honor to be able to do a little bit of opening protocol this morning to start off this amazing conference. And it is the second year that I have the blessing and privilege to be able to do that. I started with a velina ho'okipa. In our culture, it is so important that we acknowledge and recognize everyone. So the velina ho'okipa is a little long, welcoming those who may have come from afar as the continent or beyond, welcoming all of you who call Hawaii your home, from the island of Hawaii, moku o ke ave, all the way to the onenene o Ni'ihau, the shifting sands of Ni'ihau, which includes all of the islands in between as well. Our kupuna, our elders, both seen and unseen, who are here with us. The makua, adults, opio, our youth, and our keiki, our children, are all included in that greeting, in that warm welcome of aloha. And so I hope you felt that as the words were being spoken. Now at this time, I want to share with you an oli aloha. So oli aloha are chants that are done as a greeting, as a welcoming. The intention is to make you feel welcomed to an event, to a place, to the space that we are sharing here today. This oli aloha, a line from it says, "E li'a nei ho'i o kahiki mai." I have long awaited your arrival. A hiki pu no oi me ke aloha, and you have arrived with great feelings of love, great feelings of aloha. Many hands have come together to make this event happen, and I'm sure that they have all been anxiously awaiting your arrival. The intention of the oli is to make you feel that aloha and share that aloha throughout this event. O na kahala me klehu ai he halele hua no yana kano o ka uno ia no inei e li'a nei ho'i o ka hiki mai, a hiki mai no oukou, a hiki pu no me ke aloha. Aloha e, aloha e. Aloha aloha, mahalo.
Aloha and good morning, everyone, and mahalo to Kumu, Luana. Thank you so much for your beautiful protocol. You put both our hearts and our minds in the right place. You inspired us for the conversations we'll be having together over the next 2 days. It is time to reflect on the lessons of an extraordinarily challenging time for Maui as we continue the ongoing and complex recovery from the August wildfires. It is a time to reflect on our future as we explore ways to become more resilient in the face of rapidly changing climate. Aloha, I'm Leslie Wilkins. I am honored to serve as the President and CEO of Maui Economic Development Board. We are the host of the 11th Annual Hawaii Energy Conference, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to be together with us to explore the theme, Reimagining Resilience. Let me start by thanking our venue, the Maui Arts and Cultural Center, and its leader, Art Vento, and his team. It is a pleasure to return to the Castle Theater, beautiful venue for Maui. And the next 2 days, we will hear from experts on topics such as whether biofuels can really support resilience while lowering carbon emissions, and how resilience planning can prioritize historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. We will hear from state leaders what gaps need to be filled to ensure progress on Hawaii's energy goals, as well as discussions on resilience from the perspective of solar, of distributed energy resources, virtual power plants, housing, transportation, and more. If we are talking about resilience, we have to talk about the future workforce. So we will also look at how skilled labor is needed to fill the increasing demand. We would like to begin by saying thank you. So just a moment as we pull up those slides and our program committee. Today's program, absolutely, you heard our Oli recognize the hard work of the program committee. Today's program would not be possible without the hard work, dedication, and vast networks of our volunteer program committee, led by our conference chair, Jackie Hoover, who's the executive director and chief executive officer of our sister organization, Hawaii Island Economic Development Board, and our dear friend. Together, they have curated the theme, identified topics, recruited speakers, and many are moderating panels. We are proud of the work that they have done together under these challenging times to shape a program that focuses on the challenges and the opportunities before us all in building that resilient, sustainable, affordable, secure, and equitable energy future. At this point in time, can I please have all the members of the program committee please stand to be recognized. Some of them are backstage, but please stand to be recognized. Thank you for your dedication and volunteerism. All right. So continuing with our thank yous, we would like to recognize our very generous sponsors. This conference could not happen without their generosity. Please hold your applause to the end of me recognizing all of them. First of all, at the champion level, we would like to thank the Ulapono Initiative. Thank you so much. And then at the stakeholder level, it's the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, better known as HNEI. At the advocate sponsor level, we have Alkahi Energy, Burns and McDonnell, Hawaii Energy, Hawaiian Electric, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW, Local 1186, Island Energy Services, Moss and Associates, PAR Hawaii, Council for the Native Hawaiian Advancement, Solarize 808, and Terraform Power. At our sponsor supporter level, we have AES Hawaii, Canadian Solar, Generac, Hawaii Gas, HNU Energy, JM Distributed Solutions, Jurten Technology, Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, Novatech Automation, Pacific Panel Cleaners, Puna Geothermal Venture, and Trio Energy Alliance. Mahalo to our exhibitors also, but let's take a moment for applause for our sponsors. Mahalo to our exhibitors. We have designated times throughout the conference program for you to meet them. Please visit the exhibit hall to learn about their latest projects and offerings, connect with their representatives and points of contacts, or schedule a meeting with them. Next, let's take a look at where we live and work and the industry sectors that we all represent. We are pleased to welcome to the conference energy leaders from Hawaii, from Canada, Korea, and across the continental U.S. And in the snapshot of our island state, we can see this important discourse as a priority for all of us, because we thank you for all being here and being part of the conversation. As we look at attendance by industry, we see an equal number of those engaged in policy and governments, energy management and development, and commercial endeavors. We are happy to welcome back many returning participants, and to those of you who are first-timers, we are delighted you made the decision to join us. Mahalo. If you haven't already, please download the conference app. You can ask questions in the app by going to the relevant session that's on the stage at the time, and network and chat by clicking on the attendee tab. We hope you will also share your feedback to help us learn and improve the next year. We really take it very seriously. Please complete the survey. You will also find a link in the conference app to the evaluation survey. Well, since the inception of this conference 11 years ago, the County of Maui has been a partner and supporter of the Hawaii Energy Conference, and they remain so today. We would like to thank Mayor Richard Bisson for his administration's emphasis on energy and our economic future. Thus, it is our privilege to invite to the stage Josiah Nishita, the Managing Director of the County of Maui, on behalf of the Mayor. In his role of overseeing probably one of the most challenging but integral efforts of our community, he is the chair of the County of Maui's newly established Office of Recovery. He has been instrumental in advocating for and guiding the recovery efforts related to the fires of last August. Please help me welcome Josiah to the stage to give opening remarks from the county and the mayor.
Good morning, everyone. Aloha and big mahalo to Maui Economic Development Board and all of their partners for putting on such a great conference. You know, on a personal note, I had the opportunity and privilege many years ago, although it seems like just yesterday, to serve as a summer intern at Maui Economic Development Board. And so, you know, we really appreciate their efforts for our community members to help keep our kama'aina at home, provide pathways for success for our kids, to be able to, you know, continue to grow and thrive here and raise their families here as well. And we appreciate all of your folks' efforts as well. On behalf of Mayor Richard Bisson and the people of Maui County, welcome you to Maui and thank you for attending the Hawaii Energy Conference, which has its roots on Maui and underscoring what we love to say here, Maui no ko'oi, Maui is the best. For 11 years, conference founders, organizers, and supporters have done an exceptional job putting together a conference that explores innovation, comprehensively brings together policymakers, industry representatives, and community leaders, and prompts critical discussions that impacts the lives of our residents and the livelihood of businesses. As you can imagine, 9 months after Maui experienced the country's worst wildfire disaster in a century, a tragedy that took the lives of 101 of our beloved residents, family members, and friends, 26 homes in Hula, and displaced thousands of survivors, there are extraordinary lessons that have been learned and we continue to learn as we work to help our community to rebuild and to heal from this tragedy. Together with our community, council, federal, state, nonprofit, and private sector partners, We're making strides in bringing recovery and healing to our community. No doubt it will be a very long road ahead of us, and it will take all of us, and it is our top priority. The panels and presentations at this year's conference highlight important issues communities across the nation and the world are facing, though you really need to look no further than here, right here in Maui County and our state of Hawaii for relevant examples. Innovative solutions, responsible use of energy sources, success through collaboration and decision-making with our vulnerable populations in mind requires attention, careful planning, and the combined efforts of all of us here working with and for our communities that we serve. As we face the future ahead of rebuilding Lahaina, the need and opportunity to ensure safety and resiliency are at the forefront of planning efforts. Part of that is ensuring that we explore advances in renewable energy technology, find ways to apply new innovations, and continue to protect and preserve our natural and cultural resources. Resiliency also means that our community is included and that their input is heard and valued. This year's conference theme of reimagining resilience is fitting for Maui, even far beyond the energy sector. And as our island, our people, and our economy rebound from this tragedy, our future will be built on a foundation of resilience. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being a part of that future in your work. And we really hope that you enjoy another great Hawaii Energy Conference and appreciate all of the efforts from Maui Economic Development Board and all of its partners in putting this on for us here today. So on behalf of Mayor Bisson, extend our appreciation to all of you and hope you have a great conference ahead. Mahalo and aloha.
Mahalo, Josiah. We really appreciate it. We would also like to thank and recognize our council members and legislators for prioritizing the conversation on energy. We're very grateful. As we see them arrive, we'll try to recognize and say mahalo in person. And we appreciate those of you who are able to join us and those who have sent their representatives if they could not make it. Thank you so much. Now it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage a seasoned veteran of the Energy Conference stage. In fact, he has the distinction of being the first conference chair 11 years ago, and he continues to give his guidance in Manaʻo on shaping energy conference without fail. And that is Doug McLeod, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you so much, Doug.
Aloha, folks, and mahalo for the gift of your time and sharing that with us. Over the years, as the program committee, we've had times where we really had to agonize over what to feature and what to cover in a keynote address. This wasn't one of those years. We knew the topic that we needed to cover. The question is how to have a discussion that's useful about wildfires and resilience when there are so many active lawsuits and things going on. So what we decided was we would bring expertise from other places. And hopefully you as the audience will find some lessons here that we can all use in Hawaii as well. Our keynote speaker this morning is Katherine Blunt. We're thrilled to have her, and I just want to make a pitch to all of you. If you haven't read her book, she's a wonderful writer, and it's a very interesting story. Katherine's going to make a presentation about her book, California Burning, and then afterwards, Colton Ching from Hawaiian Electric, also on our program committee, and I will sit down with Katherine and have a follow-up discussion with her about some of the implications. But again, we want to go ahead and get things started here, and thank you again for your time, and welcome Katherine Blunt.
Good morning. I am truly honored to be here, and I know everyone in the audience recognizes the real importance of having this conversation, certainly in the wake of the real tragedy that happened here in August, but also in light of the fire activity that we're seeing not only throughout the western United States, but Canada and other areas as well throughout the world. And so just by way of introduction, I cover utilities for the Wall Street Journal and power issues as well. And a lot of my work is focused on PG&E, the utility company serving almost all of Northern and Central California. It is, I'm sure everyone here is at least vaguely familiar with the many challenges this company has faced over the years. It is really an excellent lens through which to understand the many complexities of utility wildfire risk and how utility companies have come to understand this and ultimately address this. And so I'd like to start it's just to sort of situate us. Let's see if I can go back here. Yeah, so for PG&E, the real turning point, I suppose you could call it, was November 8th of 2018, when a hook holding up a high voltage wire on a transmission line running through the very remote part of the Sierra Nevada foothills broke nearly in half. The wire swung against the metal structure. Sparks settled in the dry brush below, and within minutes, this fire was entirely out of control. This line was situated in a place that made it very difficult to access, not only for PG&E employees, but for firemen as well. And within hours, the town of Paradise was destroyed. Excuse my voice, and a couple of nearby communities as well. 84 people died, an 85th died by suicide as the flames approached. And it was unspeakable, right? And so within several weeks, it became clear that PG&E's infrastructure was very likely implicated in this disaster. So I often say, to really understand PG&E's story, you need to have some understanding of 100 years of history and close understanding of about 20. So let's first go back. PG&E, like many utility companies, was built by real pioneering men who recognized the potential of electricity, and they were really focused, at least in California, on building hydroelectric powerhouses, and then ultimately carrying that power to serve San Francisco and other growing areas of the state. For PG&E, it formed in 1905 after the acquisition of a number of smaller power companies that were trying to do the same thing. And the company really only had one real competitor for its early existence, and that was a company called Great Western. And Great Western had focused on building a very valuable hydroelectric system in a part of the Sierra called the Feather River Canyon, and building a very large and powerful transmission system to then carry that power south to San Francisco. The two companies competed for a period of time, but it was quickly becoming conventional wisdom that power companies should serve as monopolies. I mean, this is a capital-intensive business. Why build duplicative infrastructure? And with that came regulation, sort of the utility business model that we know today. The two companies merged in 1930. This created PG&E's, kind of current-day monopoly, a service territory covering 70,000 square miles. Today, it serves about 15 million customers. And with that, the company had a lot of financial might. It built out a lot of infrastructure to serve the population boom post-World War II. It even got an award for doing this. It was the largest expansion of the power system the industry had seen at the time. But with this acquisition of Great Western, PG&E came to own a transmission system that it had no role in building. And in the many years since then, records and relevant information about it simply got lost. And so it really wasn't until November 8th, 2018, that the company confronted the fact that this century-old infrastructure was riddled with problems. I mean, it's in remote areas. I think I said this before, but the hook that broke was hung for about 56 cents in 1915, and had been in place ever since. So fast forward to sort of the next really significant turning point for PG&E, and a really relevant part of its history was the California energy crisis. I don't know if anyone in the room lived through that or is very familiar with it, but it was quite the disaster. So bear with me as I try to explain the roots of this. California was really the first state to begin in earnest an experimentation with deregulation. It's a bit of a misnomer. Utilities will always be regulated, but California, in the late 90s, was grappling with the fact that electricity prices had become very expensive. The state's utilities had overspent on building nuclear plants. They had some sort of 70s and 80s era power contracts that were quite expensive, and this had played into an overall run-up in the cost of electricity. So the idea was, if the utilities sold their power plants to unregulated businesses, those businesses would then compete to sell the output at the lowest possible cost, wholesale power prices would fall. And the utilities acquiesced to this, but they said, we still need to recoup the cost of these contracts, recoup the cost of these nuclear plants. And so California came up with a market structure in which the utilities had a cap on what they could charge in terms of retail rates. The hope was that wholesale prices would be much lower than that. They could keep the difference until those stranded costs were recouped, and the market would, continue apace. That was the hope. But that's not what happened. It worked well for a minute, and then wholesale power prices went through the roof, in part because of issues with hydro and natural gas prices. But the new players in this market, including prominent traders such as Enron, figured out how easy it was to manipulate this new structure and artificially created scarcity and real issues with supply and demand. California experienced rolling blackouts a couple of times. This, of course, was a real political crisis for Governor Gray Davis. And for the utility companies, they're buying wholesale power at extremely high prices. Can't recover that through rates because of the cap on retail prices. All of the utilities take on a lot of debt. PG&E was the only of the big three to seek bankruptcy protection, which was really remarkable, right? This is not common in this industry. Utilities are all but guaranteed the ability to collect revenue and make a profit because of the way the system is structured. So this becomes not only a political disaster, but a financial one for the state. And so on here we have, I think on the cover of the LA Times, that's someone who's getting rescued from an elevator that stopped during one of the series of rolling blackouts. And this kind of goofy placard was something that hung around PG&E's building as they were going through their bankruptcy process. It says, "Stay the course, PG&E's plan of reorganization." And for PG&E, when it emerges around 2005, this bankruptcy had real consequences in the way investors saw this company. And so PG&E was very intent on trying to regain the goodwill of Wall Street and demonstrate that it was going to be a consistently profitable investment, not even just in sort of the traditional widows and orphans way, but it really wanted to demonstrate that it would produce solid returns for shareholders. I'm sure a lot of people in this room know this, but utilities make money in a somewhat unusual way. They make a regulated rate of return on large capital investments that improve the overall value of the system. They do not make money on day-to-day operations and maintenance costs. You can recoup those costs through customers, but you do not profit on that. So the best financial performers within the industry are adept at keeping those operations and maintenance costs low and freeing up money to invest as capital and ultimately earn a return on the investment. So PG&E at this time embarks on a pretty sweeping plan. It was called business transformation, and the idea was sort of aimed at, again, at this O&M reduction to free up money to invest as capital. And the company invited in a consulting firm to sort through its records and see where it could reduce spending. And the consultants took a look and said, "We can't really make heads or tails of your records. You're missing a lot of information, but let's try reducing spending here and here and here." And kind of a study in contrast here on this slide. This was the way that PG&E was trying to position itself, right, to ultimately become the leading utility in the United States with delighted customers, energized employees, and rewarded shareholders. Ultimately, though, this effort was really, frankly, a bust, and those who were most acutely affected by it were union members. And this is a copy of one of their newsletters that went out around the time, characterizing it as a billion-dollar bust. There was also a report card within this that graded each of the consultants' initiatives, and most of them were Ds or Fs. So a lot of work got scrambled around this time. There were a lot of layoffs. But what the company had done successfully was reduce operations and maintenance costs, and that meant ultimately it was determined that the company had really done a lot to reduce the frequency and the thoroughness of its inspection processes. That became evident first in 2010, when a natural gas pipeline exploded in San Bruno, which is a neighborhood south of San Francisco. This pipeline ejected from the ground, leaving a crater about half the width of a football field. When it did so, I mean, at first it was just a mushroom cloud of fire, 60 feet above the neighboring houses, and PG&E employees at first couldn't even believe that it would be company infrastructure. There was widespread speculation that a plane must have crashed. What else could have produced this kind of fireball, right? And it took an hour and a half to stop the flow of gas. So with this came a very extensive and lengthy federal prosecution, as prosecutors took a lot of time to try to determine what had happened, and the company ultimately went to trial over this issue. And really, at its core, what happened was PG&E was inspecting its gas transmission system with a method that just simply wasn't sufficient to get a full grasp on the risks. And there were people within the company that knew this, people within the company that had raised concerns, but at the end of the day, the inspection method that would have helped the company understand this and other risk modes was more expensive, and so therefore it wasn't done. So even as this throughout the trial and the investigation, PG&E did a reasonably good job at turning around its gas division and making it so that the employees were much more focused on safety and risk management. The man who sort of led this turnaround suggested to colleagues in the electric division that maybe they should undertake a similar effort to make sure that they were truly doing enough to assess risks that either were already present or could emerge. And the mindset of the electric division at the time was that it simply wasn't necessary. They felt as though what they were doing was sufficient. But at the time that this is going on, something else is happening throughout California. Namely, several periods of very severe drought, made worse by climate change, that resulted first in thousands of trees dying and then millions. And some trees die of lack of water, but also when they are stressed and not taking in enough water, it invites an invasive pest called the bark beetle that comes in and then finishes off the job. So just a little bit of California context. In 2007, a power line failed in San Diego. It was owned by San Diego Gas and Electric, igniting a very deadly and destructive wildfire that I think killed roughly 40 firefighters who were battling it. And with that, the California Public Utilities Commission decided to ask a simple question, which is, should the state's utilities do more to address wildfire risk? And in 2008, they launched a proceeding to invite the utilities and other stakeholders to weigh in on this. And I had meant to show a map of what was happening at this time, but in 2008, the year this proceeding kicks off, California is on fire. There are more than 1,500 fires burning throughout the state, not all caused by utilities. I mean, a lot of them were caused by lightning, actually. But a satellite passing over the state took photos in which you can see just clouds and clouds of gray smoke emanating from Northern California as dozens and dozens of fires burn throughout the forests, which again, millions of dead trees means that the consequence of a spark is much higher than it had been historically. And so the governor at the time was Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, he didn't know what to do about this. He was like, clearly, this is climate-driven risk manifesting. So, within this proceeding at the PUC as to whether the utility companies should do more to address fire risk, PG&E said that it felt it shouldn't have to do more, or be required to do more, or be required to do something like prepare a formal fire mitigation plan, because historically speaking, fire risk had been higher in Southern California. I mean, the company is saying this at a time in which there's many areas of its service territory that are burning. And the California Public Utilities Commission, the staffers reviewing these remarks, ultimately agreed They said, to our knowledge, there has never been an instance of a large wildfire caused by power lines in Northern California, so PG&E shouldn't have to be required to make a formal fire mitigation plan. It did require that of the two utilities in the South, which is San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison. So in 2012, those two companies really began looking at wildfire risk in earnest, preparing formal fire mitigation plans, and working to address the risk. PG&E did not. So, and before even kind of getting into what then happened with PG&E and its fires, I should say another really important dynamic to understand about the California Public Utilities Commission and its relationship with the utilities at this time is that around the time PG&E emerged from bankruptcy around 2005, you began to see the state of California set some very ambitious carbon reduction targets, and a lot of that centered on utilities procuring more renewable power. And so there was a certain amount at first, and then it would step up from there. So that took a lot of focus by the utilities. At the time, there wasn't a huge amount of wind and solar that had been developed. These technologies, again, at the time were fairly expensive, somewhat new. And so it was on the utilities to go out and contract with developers to figure out how to bring more of this online. And if you were working within the California Public Utilities Commission, you definitely wanted to be working on this policy side of things. I mean, it had the goodwill of the legislature. This was sort of like new, and it was sort of the sexy division within which to be. By contrast, the safety division of the PUC was chronically understaffed and underfunded. I had in speaking to one former commissioner, he sort of bluntly put it that safety simply wasn't glamorous. And another challenge too is that if you are, a young staffer within the PUC and you're looking at, distribution line risk, you can do the same thing and get paid twice as much at the utility company. And so there was a lot of sort of back and forth of folks getting started at the commission and then moving into industry. And so there was a lot of focus both within the utility companies and within the regulatory body in, bringing this renewable energy online. And that's obviously, it's a good thing. Right? Climate change is real. The energy transition has to accelerate. And California's early investments in this technology helped to create the economies of scale that ultimately really drove down the cost of wind and solar. But at the same time, within both the PUC and within PG&E, there simply weren't commensurate resources in terms of folks looking at climate-driven operational risk. And that becomes painfully evident in October of 2017 when almost 20 major wildfires ignited in California wine country in Napa, Sonoma counties. The fires killed at least 22 people. It's possible PG&E's lines were implicated in another fire that killed another 22 for a total of 44. The before and after is very stark, right? And so the primary issue in 2017 was the fact that trees were coming into contact with PG&E's power lines when the winds picked up. In California, very strong winds pick up September, October time. They're, in the north, they're called the Diablo winds. And so the winds were blowing very strongly several times over the course of this month in October of 2017. And either a tree itself would fall into a live wire, or a branch would get picked up from 60 feet away and get tangled in the conductor. And so what PG&E realized is that it wasn't doing enough to keep vegetation away from these lines. I mean, distribution lines are lower voltage wires that serve homes and businesses, right? The stuff in your neighborhood or on the street. So in the wake of these fires, it really embarks on this massive tree clearing program to try to play catch up and figure out where it had fallen short. And then, just over a year later, we have the Camp Fire, the fire that ignited when this century-old transmission tower failed. The hook that was original infrastructure from 1915 broke in half. Here you can see, if you can see just, the way that this broke. This is the hook that broke. That little piece just toward the edge shows like how much it had worn through. And it's really quite simple to imagine. So this hook, so if you have a plate, this hook hung like this, and it had a string of insulator discs, and the wire was here. And as the winds blew over the course of a century, the hook rocked against this metal plate, and the metal plate ultimately wore through the hook. And when you think about it, it's frankly amazing it lasted even 100 years, because this original infrastructure, I mean, some of this was sort of experimental material. Electric transmission was a new idea at the time, and like the industry standards have changed a lot in the intervening years. And so it's amazing to think that this analysis, this is an analysis I'd done at the Wall Street Journal, I think in 2019, so these numbers are even a little bit outdated, but at the time when we were looking at this, the oldest towers are 108 years old, when the average life expectancy is 65, 68. So then PG&E embarks on this inspection blitz after this fire and realizes that this tower is not an anomaly. There's a lot of tiny pieces of hardware throughout the oldest part of the transmission system, these towers, kind of strung throughout the Sierra foothills that, pieces on the verge of breaking. I mean, it could have happened elsewhere. And so it revealed the extent to which it had not been doing proper inspection and maintenance on the transmission system. So as the company is trying to work through these problems, whether it's the proximity of trees to the distribution lines or the issues with fixing some of the oldest parts of the transmission system, it begins relying very heavily on what's known as a public safety power shutoff. This is not PG&E's idea. The Southern California utilities have been doing this from time to time for a number of years, and the idea is when the winds pick up and the risk of infrastructure failure is higher, the utility will proactively shut off the power so that if there is indeed some sort of issue, whether it's vegetation related or otherwise, there will be no ignition. And PG&E first deployed this at scale in 2019. It just sort of, frankly, indiscriminately cut power to different circuits because it was, absolutely terrified of igniting another fire. The winds were very strong. At peak, I think about 5 million people were without power, some for as long as 4 days. It was really challenging. And there was a lot of issues associated with this. For one, there is technology that utilities can install to make it so that you can be more surgical as you're proactively shutting things down. It's called sectionalizers. PG&E didn't have very many of those throughout the system, so it meant that if you're shutting off a risky circuit, less risky circuits might have to go off with it. In doing this well, utilities are also supposed to have plans and protocols in place to alert people who are truly dependent on electricity, whether for medical needs or other really life critical needs. And it had incomplete records in this way. It wasn't able to alert everybody who could be affected by the blackouts. And so, it was just, but that being said, these are photos taken right after the blackouts, in which you can see there was real risk averted in doing that, real ignition risk, despite the fact that the company, in so doing, created other risks for customers. It's a really difficult trade-off between safety and reliability. There's really significant issues to consider on both sides. The company has since done more to install those sectionalizers, make sure that it's alerting customers properly, being more surgical in its approach. This is an iterative process. And but the company has a new CEO who came in early 2021. Her name is Patty Poppy. And 6 months into her time at the helm, a tree fell on a tiny power line not far from Paradise that was destroyed in the Camp Fire. This was July of 2021, and the sparks that settled beneath the power line ultimately became the second largest fire in California history, destroying more than 1 million acres. No one died, but it was, this fire spread all along not only near Paradise, but just in all this old infrastructure, these remote areas of the Sierra. And so she went up to the area to sort of address the public. And she made a really bold and risky announcement that even surprised PG&E's board of directors, that the company would commit to burying 10,000 miles of power lines. And the idea being, if the line is underground, it cannot start a fire. And it's a risky announcement because the company had not really formulated a plan as to how it would do this, certainly from an engineering perspective, but also from a cost perspective. Retrofitting the system to run underground is a really expensive proposition. Like right now, industry estimates probably $3 million a mile. And so that has kicked off a really interesting debate within California. as the company has been trying to pursue this plan. In order to do so, it needs approval from the PUC because it's going to require raising rates, right? And already rates in California are very high for a lot of different reasons and have become higher as all of the utility companies pursue fire risk mitigation measures. And it's still ongoing. There was last year in particular just this big question of how much should PG&E be permitted to underground, how much should it be allowed to spend on this at a time, again, not only when rates are high, but we're living in a very inflationary environment, and any cost increase is very difficult, especially for lower income customers and those that live in the Central Valley and have to use a lot of air conditioning, for example. And so it remains to be seen whether the company will be able to not only achieve its goal, but do so in a way that isn't significantly burdening customers. I mean, cost considerations are very real, and certainly, as we know in Hawaii, I mean, electricity costs are quite high as well, right? And so there's certainly many aspects of this to unpack. You know, it is, I will say, you know, the PG&E has done a lot in the years since these tragedies to try to get its arms around fire risk. The people who are working there are really committed to trying to do it and do it well. But it's really unfortunate that it often takes a disaster like this to prompt action. And it's not just PG&E. You know, it's like we've seen, of course, what happened here in Hawaii, but the utility in Oregon is struggling with very significant liability costs stemming from a series of fires in 2020. Xcel, which is a utility company serving many parts of the West and Midwest, is grappling with this in Colorado. There's issues that have just emerged recently in Texas, the Texas Panhandle. And so it's a set of complex issues that are not going away anytime soon, and in fact are just becoming more urgent as we continue to see climate risk manifest. And so I look forward to joining Doug and Colton here on stage to hopefully discuss it a bit more and put it in a broader context. So I hope this was useful. And again, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. I'm sure that folks in the audience will have some questions for you, you know, at breaks and all in the conference, but I know we have some questions for you as well. And I guess just to kind of get things started, you know, you're a reporter, you're covering the energy scene. What was it that made you realize that here it wasn't just going to be an article, that this was a book? That, you know, what were the characteristics that made this a book rather than a news story?
Sure. Well, I suppose to start, I want to recognize a couple of really talented former colleagues of mine, Russell Gold and the late Rebecca Smith. The three of us worked really hard for the majority of 2019 to try to really highlight and bring together all the complex factors that played into this story, not just sort of the mismanagement and missteps of PG&E, but also the very relevant political, regulatory, and climate factors. And so sort of with that, it was a literary agent actually asked if I would consider using that work as the foundation of a book. And my initial reaction was, I mean, it's a really challenging narrative because unlike, you know, Theranos, you don't have Elizabeth Holmes to follow through the whole thing, right? There's not a single person. PG&E itself is the character and people come and go. I mean, they're very interesting people, but there's, it's an idea-driven book, but she felt as though we could make it work, and I'm really glad we did because it is such a complex story. I think it is best told at book length. You can really, you know, unpack the relevant aspects of it and bring it all together.
Well, I know that one of the questions some of the audience have to be thinking is there a book coming about Hawaii? I mean, is there a book to be written about the Hawaii fires?
I'm sure there is. I mean, it's just as complex. I mean, and it's complex in similar ways, but also different ways. I mean, Hawaii is unique in certain respects, and I think something that would look at that deeply and again bring together all of the many factors that converge to ultimately result in a tragedy like this, yes, I think that there is.
So we talked a little bit about this while we were in one of our prep calls, Katherine, but for the audience, Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway provided comments in his open letter to shareholders, as well as during his shareholder meeting, I think earlier this month. I know you're familiar with it, so if you could share with all of us your thoughts about it, what do his words mean towards the level of risk utilities in general are facing?
Yeah, it was a fascinating letter and commentary that he put out. So we mentioned earlier the fires in Oregon. PacifiCorp is a utility owned by Berkshire Hathaway, and the company is facing millions of dollars in liability costs tied to these fires that occurred over Labor Day in 2020, and it resulted in the Berkshire Hathaway took a loss as a result. And in his shareholder letter, Warren Buffett said that that it will take a while for Berkshire to get a grasp on the extent of the damages and ultimate liabilities, but it will not knowingly throw good money after bad. And he said that as utilities across the West face wildfire risk, he called into question how long investors will be willing to basically underwrite it. And, you know, I think the big takeaway from that is that this is, I mean, it's certainly not a California issue or an Oregon issue or Hawaii issue. This is an issue certainly throughout the West and likely throughout the country, ultimately. And that investors are beginning to wake up to the fact that utilities need to do more to address this risk. And not only that, but there's certainly, you know, trying to actually mitigate the risk and, you know, make operational improvements. But you're beginning to see, you know, the plaintiff's bar is getting smart on these issues too, and bringing, you know, for example, alleging negligence if a utility doesn't have plans in place to proactively shut off the power, right? And that's a fascinating and new dynamic because the PSPS protocols have not been used frequently for a very long time, right? This is sort of something that all utilities across the West are trying to figure out how to put in place, some of which have never really had to think about it before.
As far as the Berkshire comments, I guess, are you reading it that he's basically saying that the risks in this business have changed so much that we are not getting paid at a level that compensates for these risks? It's just across the board a much riskier business of making electricity.
Well, I think specifically he was kind of referring to the prospect of almost uncapped liability costs. I mean, not only, sort of, for example, Berkshire Hathaway is facing liability not only with it, like, related to loss of property and life and other things, but also non-economic damages for those who were sort of tangentially associated or you know, affected by the fires. And so, for example, I think Berkshire lobbied for legislation in Utah that would cap uneconomic damages. But you know, I think that it calls into question something very important, which is that none of this can be done overnight. And utilities have to make substantial investments over the course of years. But will investors be willing to stick around for that long in terms of waiting for the, you know, the real improvements to be made? And who are those investors, right? Are they sort of like patient money, or do you begin to see those that are sort of requiring higher returns? And I think it's something certainly that the industry is grappling with right now. In the wake of the shareholder letter, Patty Poppe of PG&E was quick to sort of criticize it and say she felt as though that the commentary shouldn't apply to California because there's been a lot of operational changes made, of course, but also legislation that's meant to help the state's utilities manage liability costs, but that's not the case everywhere. And again, like these sorts of changes don't happen quickly or overnight.
If I can add just one to this topic, Katherine. So Warren's comment, Warren Buffett, I should be calling him my first name.
On a first name basis, excellent.
Yeah, my pal Warren. But Warren Buffett's letter and his message to shareholders were, you know, of course, driven from the perspective of Berkshire Hathaway, right? An owner of an investor-owned utility in PacifiCorp and others. But that, just hearing what you just said earlier, that difference in risks associated with the utility business, that's there regardless of what kind of utility it is, right? It's really about just the meat and bones of operating an electric system in an environment that is changing, right? And there are a lot of mitigations you can do, but the space and place in which our infrastructure is laid is really changing. So could you, if you don't mind, take what Warren said and kind of talk about from your perspective and all of the research you've done, how does this impact the broader electric utilities, not just the investor-owned utilities and their investors? We're unique in some ways, but how does it affect the many other municipalities and cooperatives that actually are the majority of electric services in the U.S.?
Yeah, so, I mean, with this letter, Warren Buffett sort of raised the prospect that perhaps the investor-owned utility model in the West is no longer viable, which, I mean, there's not really that many alternatives to an investor-owned utility. There's really just two that are in use throughout the United States. It's either like a municipal-owned utility or what's known as a cooperative, in which the customers own the utility. You often see that in more rural areas that the IOUs historically haven't been as interested in serving, just because of lack of population density or other things. And so, but at the end of the day, right, like the risk of operating an overhead system of power lines is, well, it was put this way. I mean, the consequence of infrastructure failure is the same no matter who owns it, right? And so if you were to, and I guess talking about it in the context of PG&E, in the wake of these disasters, there was serious conversation about whether it should continue to exist as an IOU. And there was a couple of plans put forward in which some cities kind of proposed defecting from the system and creating their own municipal utilities. There was a plan to convert it into what would have been the nation's largest co-op. But ultimately, the question of ownership, I mean, it solves some problems but creates other ones, right? So the idea is to remove the profit motive. PG&E has sort of struggled with this historically, but then, say if it's owned by the state or if it's owned by the customers themselves, I mean, that means liabilities either become a taxpayer issue or a customer issue, and you still need a huge amount of capital to make the necessary improvements. And where's that going to come from? It comes from the customers or it comes from the taxpayers. And so, historically the thinking has been that the investor-owned model is the most efficient means for these companies to raise the capital needed to run the business. And if you see that change or become more limited, I mean, that creates a lot of problems, but the alternative isn't necessarily better, I don't think, or any easier, let's put it that way.
I guess I'd like to ask a follow-up question about bankruptcy. So in your book, you talk about how PG&E has actually been through bankruptcy twice. And listening to your discussion about how the risk of these fires exists regardless of who owns the assets, I guess it just, are we stuck, in this model going forward? Is there, really going to be a way out of this? Do you see a path for something being affordable for people?
I was just reflecting on the fact that I completely neglected to make clear that after the 2017-2018 fires, PG&E filed for bankruptcy a second time. And it was a huge, huge challenge. And ultimately, the people sort of most negatively affected by it were the fire victims themselves. Well, the companies too. I mean, it was a sort of remarkable use of the restructuring process in which PG&E, so I should say, some very savvy investors got involved in this as sort of a distressed investment play. The company came out with more debt than it went in with, and without an investment-grade credit rating. And it ended up so that by the time the company had to reach a settlement with people who had lost homes and businesses and loved ones, it didn't have enough cash to compensate the full value of their claims. So they were compensated half with cash and half with shares in the company itself that were administered through a trust. And of course, on principle, that was extremely upsetting for fire victims. And it was also a real logistical challenge in the sense that fire victims held 20% of the company upon emergence, so they couldn't sell these shares overnight. the share price was also really slow to recover. And so I say that in the sense that, at least for me observing it, I thought it was a real argument for why an investor-owned utility needs to remain financially healthy and avoid this sort of outcome, because at least certainly in PG&E's case, and I would imagine in others, I mean, nobody wins here, right? It's just not a company providing a critical service like this. I mean, it just really suffers in going through a restructuring process like that. And so in terms of, is there going to be an affordable path forward? It's a really interesting question, because across the country right now, utility companies of all kinds are proposing record capital investments to not only address climate-driven operational risk, but also to prepare for electrification, the adoption of more electric vehicles, and also just to replace parts of an aging system. I mean, the grid is not just old in California, it's old everywhere. And so with that, historically, the way to fund that is to raise rates. And I think that electricity necessarily is going to become a more expensive commodity, at least for a period of time. But I know people certainly smarter than myself are trying to work on ways to mitigate this. I mean, maybe solutions at the state level or even the federal level that can help offset some of the effects of this necessary investment.
So sticking with the bankruptcy topic, Katherine, in your book you talk about the other California utilities as well, and they faced similar wildfire events, maybe not of the same scale, but in talking to my colleagues in those utilities, they themselves had at times been very close to filing for bankruptcy as well, right? They were pretty much on the edge. So from your research, what do you think made the difference? What made the situation for PG&E going through its second bankruptcy versus San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison, and now the Oregon and Colorado utilities, not yet having to declare bankruptcy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the extent of the damages. I mean, when you consider the fact that between 2017 and 2018, more than 100 people died in these fires, thousands of homes lost, thousands of businesses lost, and not to get too wonky about it, but California has a very strict liability construct. Utilities are liable for any and all damages resulting from fires ignited by their power lines, regardless of how they maintained them. So it was sort of a foregone conclusion that PG&E was going to face billions and billions of dollars of liability costs. The estimate at the time that they sought bankruptcy protection was $30 billion. And, I mean, there was certainly issues with negligence, so, but what you begin to see, it's slightly different in, for example, Oregon, where you have to prove negligence in order to successfully recoup liability costs from the utility. But there's been several juries at this point that have come to determine that, and I don't know the current liability. I think it's hundreds of millions that Pacific Core is facing, and so it's substantial. I mean, that's a much smaller utility than PG&E, so proportionately it's really quite a bit. And I think that's just the question to that utilities are going to have to grapple with. I mean, what is the potential exposure? And it's a very hard question to answer.
We're trying to talk about resilience this year, and obviously wildfires are the first thing that comes to mind right now. But has what happened in terms of the wildfires in PG&E changed the way people are looking in California at other resilience issues? So are they reconsidering earthquake risk? Are they revisiting some of the other risks associated with natural disasters?
I certainly hope so. But I think, a question that's another very difficult one to answer is like, what's the next risk, right? Because it's unfortunate but true that it often really takes a disaster to prompt this sort of examination of, risk and how to address it. And so I think when you think, just in the utility context, PG&E has been very focused on fire risk for a long time. I mean, it also has a very old fleet of hydroelectric powerhouses, a very big hydro system. It still operates Diablo Canyon, which is the last nuclear plant in California. And I mean, I'm not saying that there's imminent risk of failure in those divisions. I'm just saying that like there's a lot that the company has to keep its eye on as it's trying to do all of this and try to be proactive in figuring out if there's risk associated with that, right, and what needs to be done about it. And then in terms of earthquake risk and other things, I mean, I know certainly sea level rise is something that not only the utility companies but other stakeholders in California are looking at. I mean, earthquake risk is always present, but yeah, it's certainly the climate-related ones are getting at least more attention.
Well, I know we could talk all morning, but our time really has come to an end, and so audience, could we get another round of applause for our speaker today, Katherine?